what we do with all these procedures is nothing more than a fancy Band-Aid. Well, that got me thinking a lot. It took me many months to get to this idea of how do you detect heart disease in its early phases. So not when it needs a procedure, not when it results in catastrophe, but how do we identify heart disease in the years or decades before disaster strikes? Now, this was a good 12 years ago or so, and back then, this idea of heart scanning was just getting underway. A lot of the data was just being developed. But I found an interesting notion. The idea is that you can detect coronary plaque or atherosclerotic plaque in its early phases. Now, it's hard to see this stuff. This stuff is soft, it's cholesterol-ridden, it's full of inflammatory cells. You can't image it very easily, and you certainly couldn't 10, 12, 14 years ago. But back then, the idea came out of Mayo Clinic that, you could see calcium in coronary arteries. And Dr. John Rumberger, who is a very interesting guy and a friend of mine, did the basic background research to show that calcium composed 20%, fairly consistently, 20% of coronary atherosclerotic plaque. And this held true if you were a man or a woman, if you were young or you're old, or whether you died of coronary disease or died of some other cause, like a car accident. And so that was eye-opening for me. If calcium could be imaged, quantified, measured, and composed 20% of coronary plaque consistently, this suggested that you and I could measure this thing pretty easily, because you can measure calcium in people's coronary arteries pretty readily. And that's how this whole notion got started. I tried to get an EBT scanner going in Milwaukee for the longest time. It took a lot of talking, persuading, because, if you talk to hospitals about prevention, what they hear is, oh, that's all well and fine, but is there a way to turn this into revenues? So we always have to be mindful of the fact that hospitals are not in the business of health. They're in the business of disease and fixing disease and using procedures or other revenue-generating procedures to fix disease. There's not a lot wrong with that unless that's all you want to do.
Right.
And so what I found was a lot of dead ends when I tried to get that conversation going. As it turns out, fast forward a little bit, I met some people who brought the sufficient money to do just that. And that was the first heart scan device in Wisconsin. Now there are several dozen, which has made me very happy, because it means that I think heart scanning is being brought into the mainstream. It's still a great source of confusion. One of the great sources of confusion is that proportion of calcium to plaque, and that still causes a great deal of argument and debate about soft and hard plaque and so on. But nonetheless, I look back, Jimmy, and I see how far we've come, and I see that now you and I can get in our car and drive just a few minutes, pretty easily be at a center that can provide a heart scan service for us, and thereby provide us with an easy means to readily, easily, inexpensively detect coronary disease years before disaster is facing us.
Now, you said there's a dozen of these such scanners across the nation, or how many did you say?
Now there are hundreds.
Hundreds.
So,
okay.
Yeah, in Milwaukee, there's about a dozen. In all of Wisconsin, probably twice or three times that. Nationwide, a lot more.
Is there a place where people can go to, like a website or something, that will have a listing of all of these? And like certain people are listening from, say, Florida or Michigan or California. Is there a place that they can go online that tells them where they can get this done?
We maintain something of a listing on our Track Your Plaque website. There's a scan site.
It's trackyourplaque.com?
Right.
Okay.
Though admittedly, we're not always up to date. We count on scan centers and people to tell us that there's been a change, places closed, somebody else has opened. There's also if you just put heart scan into your search, into your Google search or whatever you use, you'll come upon one other listing service, Scan Directory. They also list scanners. One of the difficulties is the newest technology in heart scanning is the so-called 64-slice devices, and those are popping up very quickly. Now, it's curious. I see heart scanning, of course, as a heart disease detection and prevention device, but the more recent phenomenon in the market, if we look at things that way, is that the hospitals are beginning to adopt these devices. Now, hospitals see heart scans as this not too terribly interesting, certainly not a moneymaker,
Right.
so they just do it kind of begrudgingly in the hopes that you're going to need more revenue-producing procedures. So there's this strange irony in heart scanning. Thankfully, most centers still do offer heart scans, though they might not tell you about that. You might have to call them. So many of the hospitals now, even when they're not listed in trackyourplaque.com nor in scandirectory.com, will still have a device capable of doing perfectly fine heart scans. These are the so-called 64-slice CT scanners. The old EBT devices, there's only, I think, about 80 left of those. Interestingly, they remain a very excellent technology, but GE, such as they are, bought the smaller company that produced that wonderful technology years ago, and promptly scrapped it for financial reasons, not for the value of the technology. But it means that these devices, while they were years ahead of their time at the time, are kind of just waning now. But they still are around. They remain a wonderful way to get a heart scan. So right now you have a choice of either some of the remaining EBT devices or the 64-slice CT scanners, and the emerging technology of the more than 64-slice CT scanners. Those things are changing so quickly that we can't even keep up with the clinical validation of the device. You've heard about those. There's a few 256-slice devices, and all that refers to is the number of detecting rings on the device to cut the amount of radiation involved, the amount of time required to do the scan, such that a heart scan can be performed nowadays in just a few seconds.
I got to tell you, I have turned more people on to getting a heart scan done because of you, Dr. Davis, and I myself, back in 2009, had a heart scan done just out of curiosity. I just wanted to see what this high-fat, moderate-protein, low-carb, wheat-free approach was doing for me, and lo and behold, my heart scan score came back a big fat 0.
That's great.
and people are like, so what does that mean? Does that mean you're not at risk for a heart attack? How do you know which test to find? Because I know you had told me in an email, make sure you get your doctor to prescribe the right heart scan, because there's another one that's a lot more expensive that's totally the wrong one. Can you kind of clarify that for people that are interested?
Yeah, it's really very simple, but the media has confused things, and a lot of my colleagues have too. We want this very, very simple test. It's like a mammogram of the heart. It's called a CT heart scan that yields a simple coronary calcium score. We measure calcium because it serves as an indirect measure of total plaque. What we don't want is a CT coronary angiogram, which is a CT scan, but you're given X-ray dye, so there's an IV placed, and that has an incredible amount of radiation. In fact, I was doing that many years ago. I was the first in Wisconsin doing that many years ago. In fact, I did it to myself. I had the ladies put an IV in me. We figured it out, and I did it myself. I stopped doing it, Jimmy, because of the exceptional radiation exposure of that technique. Yeah. It's a wonderful technique that yields incredible pictures, similar to what you get in a cardiac catheterization with no catheters and no invasion of the body, but it was such a high radiation burden. So I stopped using it. That still remains today a problem. So I think the technology will advance forward. It will become a great test. But right now, for the vast majority of people, with only occasional exceptions, it's too darn high a radiation exposure, approximately equivalent to 600 chest X-rays of radiation.
Wow.
So that's a very, very different test. What we're talking about for our very, very simple prevention and screening purposes is a very low radiation test. And by the way, there is no non-radiation test. I'm sure there will be sometimes, maybe in, 5 years, 10 years, you and I will be talking about the newest way to screen people and track coronary atherosclerosis. But right now, the most simple, accessible means at low radiation is this simple coronary calcium score or a heart scan.
And it was so easy to do. I mean, I walked into the office, they said, lay down, sit still for a couple minutes, did the thing, and I was done. I was like, wait a minute, is that it?
Right. And then you know, 0 is great,
yep.
But then for every Jimmy Moore with a wonderful, wonderful 0 score, there's somebody else with a score of 1,000.
Yeah.
Now, here's something worth mentioning that while we're talking about this. People are frightened to do this because they're afraid it will lead them to bypass surgery or 3 stents and heart catheterization. Mm-hmm. And that is done But it shouldn't be done that way. This is a tool for prevention. It's a tool for tracking. It's a tool for you to know whether or not you should engage in a more intensive effort to gain control of heart disease risk.